Let's move on, though, and talk a little bit about the ongoing Say Her Name movement that's going on. Obviously, it started with, specifically this specific thing started with Sandra Bland, but it obviously goes back to all types of violence towards Black women. And let's talk about the importance of that specific, I guess, movement within this whole entire broader movement.
Right, yeah. So Say Her Name actually is the name of a report that was put out by the African American Policy Institute. It's a report that was co-written by Kimberly Crenshaw and Andrea Ritchie. For people who know the term intersectionality, basically Kimberly Crenshaw wrote the article, the very, very kind of seminal article that revived and gave a name to a concept that's been in existence for a while. And so that's her institute that basically put out that report. Andrea Ritchie is a longtime organizer, activist, and lawyer that addresses police issues, particularly police issues against women, trans and non-trans. And so they put out a report that's called Say Her Name, but the actual Say Her Name was kicked off in May by an organization called BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100, the Chicago chapter, along with other groups here in Chicago. And it came out of a sense of just despair in some way after Dante Servin, the officer who killed Rekia Boyd, a young woman of color, young Black woman here in Chicago, who was killed when she was, I think, 22 years old by Dante Servin in her own neighborhood, basically for being, according to Dante Servin, a nuisance and loud with her friends. And he says that he accidentally shot her. And so Rekia was, when Dante Servin was acquitted in April, a group of organizations here in Chicago came together at a meeting to talk about what next. What do we do? This acquittal happened. We know this is a situation. And out of those conversations, a series of events and actions and ideas was brainstormed, and that's what we've been acting on. So after that acquittal in April, national groups started contacting people here in Chicago, including BYP 100, and saying, how can we support? What can we do? And one of the ideas had been to go to the Chicago Police Department during the Chicago Police Board hearings or meeting and to call for the firing of Dante Servin from the Chicago Police Force, regardless of the fact that he'd been acquitted on this weird technicality by a judge. And so on the 21st of May was the first time that there was an actual gathering that used that hashtag, Say Her Name, that was national in scope. And that since then, there's been a gathering at every single police board meeting, which is usually the third Thursday of every month. And people have gone to the Chicago board meeting every single month since May to basically call for Dante Servin to be fired, and have used that kind of hashtag and the idea of saying her name as an animating part of that call for another form of more limited justice. And so what I want to say, too, that's important about that is the fact that when people are saying say her name, it's saying the name of all Black women, and that includes trans and non-trans Black women. And that's very important to understand that that's been a centerpiece of the call for saying her name. So that's on one hand what happened. The other thing that happened at that meeting was a discussion that we had that said, let's talk about reclaiming Black August. And Black August, as people might already know, is a time when a time for education of Black people, a time for Black people to reflect on our history and our culture, but to also lift up the experiences of political prisoners, particularly Black political prisoners. And that's been, for years, this Black August comes out after the killing of George Jackson, a very famous, political prisoner in the United States. And so after George Jackson is killed, some of the people who know him established basically, or know of him and know him, established this Black August. So during the month of August that you spend your time really, being disciplined, thinking about our culture and our history, making sure we lift up the lives and stories of political prisoners. Unfortunately, for many years, the only political prisoner, well, let me ask you, who's the only woman political prisoner that's a Black woman that you hear of all the time?
Well, geez. Well, I mean, she's out of the country. I think of Asada Shakur, maybe, but she's not actually behind bars, but she had to flee the country for that.
Yes.
That's the first one that popped into my head.
Yep, that's the first one, right? Yeah. It's Asada Shakur, and it's who people think of, it's who people talk about, and she tends to be the only Black woman that gets talked about during that period, during this month. Yeah. And so our real work was to say, we've got to give people other Black women political prisoners this month. We've got to insert their narratives and stories within the month. And we also need to do better at making sure that people understand that expand the notion of political prisoners and think about how Black women in particular are targeted by state violence and tell those stories. So this month we've had film screenings where we've talked about Black women in capital punishment. We've had an opening of a new exhibition called Blood at the Root that I helped to co-curate that looks and unearths the stories of state violence against Black women and talks about Black women who've been killed and brutalized and, harmed and imprisoned as part of, them being targeted by the state. And so we've done a whole series of things. We part of the action that happened this month at the police board hearing just last week that shut down the police board hearing. There's lots of articles that came out after that was done, and that was a big part of the work in terms of connecting the stories of, again, targeting of Black women by the state and lifting up Rakia's story. We wanted to make sure after we had that meeting a few months ago was to say, let's make sure that we actually, keep Rakia's name in the press and in the public's mind and don't let her be erased. And make sure that when people are calling out the names of Mike Brown and that the names of Black women who are targeted by the state are equally fluid in our mouths, and we're able to actually speak those names and say her name very explicitly and unapologetically. And so that's what this month has been, and it's been really a wonderful experience. And I feel, at least for me, it's been a magical experience where we've actually succeeded for a while in centering the voice and the voices and the experiences of Black women who are targeted by the state. So that's a little bit about, the Black August Chicago and that part of the work, and Say Her Name and the importance of saying her name. We also have to think about getting beyond just saying her name, but that's where we're at right now. Unfortunately, we're at the very beginning.
That's really interesting because actually, I guess I had it entirely. I guess I was not even aware of the actual deep origins of Say Her Name. It's something that I was wrong about that. Talk a little bit more, because so obviously people can get a pretty easy grasp along the lines of imprisonment and the police state when it comes to women and trans women. Talk a bit about the other aspects of being a political prisoner that people don't necessarily think of, because we kind of touched on that a little bit here, but talk about kind of the overall broad societal state that Black women and trans women specifically have to face.
Yeah, well, I think the importance of expanding our definition of political prisoners means that more people come into our focus as we think about that. For example, the way that people tend to define political prisoners is people who are targeted specifically for their ideology or specifically for dissenting in some way against the particular government that they are living under. And the government then goes after them and finds a way to imprison them, or to harm them in some way.
Where in this instance, it really is just existence, like people just living their lives are actually political prisoners. Just the mere action of being a black woman or a trans woman, that itself is a political act because of the societal racism towards it, essentially?
Yeah, no. So I think when we think about, expanding the definition of political prisoners and how women in particular fit under that, you can think of cases, for example, of black women who are criminalized for defending themselves, right?
Yeah.
So you have, in the case of Marissa Alexander, for example, we talked about her case on the show before. Here's a woman who was basically, who had literally been harmed for years and abused by her partner. She's being attacked and feels that her life is at risk. She fires a warning shot to ward off her abusive partner, and the state comes down on her so hard for that, right?
Whereas if she would have shot the guy, she probably would have gotten off a lot easier. She could have said, "Stand your ground." I mean, they probably still would have prosecuted her anyway because of racism and all that stuff. But the idea of her shooting in the air as a warning shot instead, they went on that technical side of it, which is again just insane.
That's right. So they go after her, and not only do they, quote unquote, seek to punish her, they also seek to make an example of her by convicting her, and then giving her a 20-year sentence, mandatory minimum, to spend in prison. Anyway, people can look at the story and how it unfolded, but that is an example of, that wouldn't be a traditional thing that you would claim to be, or you would understand as a political act. And the fact that that Marissa was a political prisoner, in that, and so lifting up those kinds of stories and putting that within the frame of political prisoners tells us something about how to, how people are being targeted within the system, and gives us a vocabulary and a syntax to understand that targeting in a different way. And so that's what I mean, and that's what we're talking about when we lift up political prisoners in new and different ways.